Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is my tracking spreadsheet for keeping track of all my worm composting systems. And I want to talk really quickly about this one entry over here. It's a line which didn't even show up in this document last time we looked at this document together a week ago. It's a bin that had been classified down here in my list of all my bins as simply storing castings, and usually when I've got a bin that's simply storing castings, I don't really keep track of it in terms of any activities, because there's no activities to be done on it other than it being emptied out at some point. So up until yesterday, this bin was listed down here as simply storing castings, but I figured it was time to give it an entry on this so that I could sort of track it a little bit better and keep it on my radar. So I changed its current state to active, and I added a new line to it, and I gave it the start date of May 10th, which was actually 65 days ago. 65 days ago was the last time I hauled out a tray of material in which all my worms had died. And it was the last of my red wiggler bins, and it was kind of a sad day because over the course of a number of weeks, I was gradually losing more and more of my red wigglers up until that point where I had lost the last of them. And I was, at that point, completely out of red wigglers. And it was kind of at that point that I decided it was something has to change, and I really sort of switched over to this really intense regimen of really focusing more on lots of bedding in all my systems, so on and so forth. I think it's been helping and making all my bins look a lot more healthy. But back to this container here. This container was just sitting out here with those castings in it, and I was really treating that stuff as kind of tainted material at this point, since it was almost seemingly incapable of supporting life since all the worms in it had died. And what I actually did was I consolidated all the material from these three bins here in which the same thing had occurred. So even though here on the document it references emptying of the bin into the garden, that never really happened. They all just stayed in those trays. And at some point along the way, I just consolidated all the material into a single tray. And then somewhere along the line, maybe a couple weeks ago, it's not captured here, I decided that there's probably baby worms in that material, so why don't I go looking for them? I stirred through the material, I agitated the material, I did bump into a few baby worms. And it told me, hey, if I was able to spot a couple just from trying to look around through there, there's probably more. So I've since been checking in on it semi-regularly. And last week, 7 days ago, I actually created a video of us checking in there and adding food. Because that bedding area that I had set up back here somewhere, I don't even remember when it occurred because I didn't document it, but the whole idea of that was that if the material is really as harsh as it is, and gradually over time I think it's been drying off and I was agitating it, so I think it's become a little bit more hospitable, but still, I wanted to give the worms in there some sort of a fresh bedding area, and as of a week ago, it's now also loaded up with some food. Not a lot of food. I put a melon rind in there, I put some coffee in there, and over time the material in the bin has been getting agitated and stirred up. The more damp stuff on the bottom has been brought to the surface, etc. And it is getting pretty dry, or at least when we last checked in on it 7 days ago, it was already getting fairly dry. And it's making me question whether that material can even sustain worms anymore. I would think it's been so dried at this point that any worms that might have still been in there up until very recently have probably, for the most part, been roaming around within the container looking for some more hospitable material to be in. And my hope is that over this time, hopefully, maybe because of the added food, maybe because of the bedding that had been put in there a few weeks ago for them, maybe we're starting to see a little bit of a turnout. So I just wanted to make reference to this new entry in my document here, since it's never been shown this way before. It's just a new thing that I'm tracking, and I'm just curious to see where things stand, because at some point soon it's going to be time to pull out whatever's in that feeding area, that collection area, get the worms out of there, and then I can really start to consider that material as worm-free and ready to be emptied in the garden. So I'm going to head out there now just to see how things look. So let's get started. So the one thing that's really interesting to me is the way this stuff just dries out so easily now for some reason. In the past, I always found that if I went digging down into a pile of castings, that the moisture down low was usually quite abundant. But to me, this stuff just seems like it's somehow drying out a lot more readily than typical castings would. And maybe it's just a matter of breaking some of these little boulders apart to release some of the moisture that's still kind of captured within them. Although some of them are so dry, they're like little rocks practically, very difficult to break apart. So, you know how it is sometimes. If it is mainly castings, then it's like a little boulder, very, very difficult to break apart. Maybe the ones that do break apart are ones that have something trapped inside that's other than castings. So the one thing I do kind of do on a regular basis in here is try to judge whether or not there's still baby worms hanging out in this material. And I must admit, when I reviewed the video from the last time we checked in here, it did seem like I was sort of brushing up against a couple of the worms that I could have easily relocated over into the collection area. I just didn't spot them at the time. I could just, you know, I could sort of see it as my hand brushes up right next to it. I could see it squirming there, and then I brush up right next to it again, and I just didn't notice it while I was actually filming last time. Sometimes what I'll try to do is just sort of jostle things around and then let it sit for a moment. And sometimes that little bit of activity is enough to get a worm that was more or less stationary to start moving a little bit, and then its movement reveals its location. But I'm certainly at the point now where I'm not expecting much to be out in this material. I mean, if it's at least 65 days that it's been sitting out here, but some of it going as far back as 72 days, I believe it was now. I don't remember what the spreadsheet said. But some of this material has been sitting out here in the yard for a very long time. And, you know, I guess the only situations that might still exist is that some cocoons sort of got caught up within these little chunks of material, and that if I continue to sort of break them apart, then maybe I'm actually going to free a cocoon. There might be cocoons still caught up within these little boulders of material that sort of got clumped together when it was all still very damp. So that was my only other thought, was that maybe just by sort of breaking this stuff gradually up, I would, as a result of doing that, free some cocoons which had up until that point been trapped inside of a little pocket of material, and maybe because of that was unable to, I don't know, to hatch or whatever the case may be. I mean, cocoons are pretty tough. I guess they're designed to survive a harsh cold winter. They can freeze and still produce baby worms. They could sit for months up until the conditions become optimal again. I think they can survive through fairly dry. Oh, there we go. Finally bumped into one of our little friends. It's probably because I'm now right on the outskirts of the edge of the collection area where there is moisture because of the plastic covering that was there. So maybe the more important section of this bin is the collection area, where we might actually spot a few worms. I'm growing less and less confident in my ability to find worms in this material out here on the edge. But, you know, today I was not planning on doing any sort of a haul out or trying to bring this container to a close. I was basically just curious to see if, after a week of having this piece of melon over here in this collection area, has it possibly inspired some worms to come over and gather around it for a little bite to eat, perhaps for a little bit of the moisture that might have come off of the frozen melon as it was thawing out. So why don't we just proceed to the inspection of the feeding area to see what kind of progress our melon is making. I can't remember though, but just to play it safe, I figured since this is a bin where I'm trying to collect baby worms, I did run down to my wormery and I grabbed this container full of pulverized eggshell, which I thought I could throw into the feeding area as grit, just in case they need grit. So I really couldn't recall offhand whether or not I'd given this feeding that I gave this container a week ago any grit. I may not have. It may have just sort of been an impromptu thing to run into the freezer and grab something to throw in here. But yeah, why don't we move all these leaves aside. They're all kind of stuck to the stems. I had just pulled a bunch of weeds out At this point, this was a few weeks ago, I believe, that I had pulled these weeds out and positioned them on top of this bedding area, which is now at this point being treated more as sort of a collection area. This was the filter in which the coffee that I threw in here last week was sitting up until I emptied it into this feeding area. So that I figured might be just treated by the worms as a little bit of supplementary bedding that they could utilize. And then I think I even tore off some of that cardboard that we saw resting on top to throw it in here too, just so that they've got a little bit of a additional carbon source in case they need it. But you know, every time I've gone looking in here, once in a while I'll spot a worm, but I've never really encountered much in terms of lots and lots of worms. I really wish I had, but to be honest, I really didn't really expect much. It was only because I did see a few worms as I was probing through the material that I thought that it might make a good, might make good sense to try to retrieve some of them. And there's a little bit of nostalgia, I suppose, attached to this whole thing too, is the fact that, you know, I started out with red wigglers that somebody gave me, and that population, I grew that population to the point where I was able to split their population and launch off multiple bins with those worms, and, you know, gradually grow my red wiggler population to a fairly nice, substantial size, only to have it all crash and burn at the end in a really unfortunate sequence of circumstances. And even though I can always get more red wigglers from elsewhere, I guess the novelty aspect of it is that it would be really nice if I could somehow revive that original population that I started out with from day one, possibly by, you know, sort of nurturing the cocoons that were left over by that population and seeing if I could rekindle them using even a few worms. So I mean, this is something that often makes me scratch my head, is that I knew that I had put a piece of watermelon rind right into here, right down this middle of this patch of bedding, all of these leaves, and as far as I could tell, there's no sign of it. I can't see even one little tiny shred of it in here. So I would have to assume that it just either melted away and became, I don't know, fluid, and it just sort of became part of this bedding at this point. Or maybe there are just some worms in here hiding or evading me, just enough that I can't seem to spot them. So maybe I've just got to look harder. I mean, no, I'll admit, I did actually spot a worm or two as I was digging through here, but nothing that I believe the camera would have caught. And you know, in that same vein, I bet you there's also worms that were visible to the camera that I missed while I was rummaging around. But here and there, I'm definitely spotting a baby worm that still does not have the signs of having a clitellum or the maturity yet to breed. So that probably implies that it's a baby worm that was hatched here within this container. And I'm sure it's not the only one, because even last time we were probing through the material and along the edge of the material, we actually found a few here and there and tried to move them over into this collection area. But I am prepared to head back inside to grab another morsel of food to put in here to see if I could just kind of keep this going to a certain point, with the assumption that there's worms in here, but they're just somehow avoiding me. But before I put in the extra bait or food or whatever you want to refer to it as, I'm going to sprinkle in some of these crushed eggshells as sort of a foundation for the feeding. Again, not remembering if I had placed any grit in here last time. And I'm going to take a short break now, run inside and grab something else that we could throw in here, and then we'll be more or less finished. Well, it's not melon, but hopefully it's something that the worms will like. It's a part of an eggplant. It was contributed by my mom last time she popped over to visit me. I guess she had purchased the eggplant in the hopes of preparing some sort of a dish with it, and she just wasn't really satisfied with the eggplant in terms of how it was looking, so she threw it in a plastic bag and figured, let's give it to the worms. She brought it over here, and it was not frozen like a lot of the stuff that I feed the worms, and I think that should be fine. In fact, I'm just wondering if it's maybe too much stuff. Hopefully not. Hopefully we've actually got some worms in here that are going to come over for this and enjoy it. So eggplant is just something that you'll not find around my place, really, because it's not one of the foods that I'm very fond of. I mean, I don't think I've ever even tasted it, so I don't even know, to tell you the truth. I'm just a little bit of a picky eater. So hopefully it's something that the worms like. I'm sure they're gonna like it, so I'm not too worried about that. So I'm just really anxious to see some sort of a turnout over here. I thought that the melon would do the trick. In a way, I almost expected to find a bunch of worms hanging out over in the feeding area, in the collection area. I'm starting to wonder if calling it a collection area is kind of giving me a little bit of too much optimism in terms of how many worms I'm going to end up rounding up out of this system. I mean, there's got to be some, you know. We've seen them on a number of occasions. And I mean, unless they actually exited the bin and left, they've still got to be in here. I'm just a little bit surprised to have only spotted maybe one or two of them during this entire time of probing around within this container. So I just keep hoping we're going to possibly bump into a spot where we've actually got a few worms hanging out that we could check out. So here's one, perhaps a little bit larger than the one that we spotted earlier. Here's another one. So yeah, I mean, they're in here obviously, but certainly not in great numbers. And I also sort of keep telling myself that, hey, maybe they're just in here, but they're still so small that you're not spotting them. That's the reason they're evading you. So yeah, I'm pretty good at giving myself excuses as to why things aren't working out the way I'd thought they would, just to kind of keep my hopes up. But yeah, you could see we've already managed to round up a couple of them over here. It just seems like they're not all that jazzed about getting over into the fresh bedding that I laid out for them. They seem perfectly content to be hanging out kind of over here on the other edge. No, maybe not so much out in the old dry material, but kind of on the edge. Maybe the bedding that I set up for them just hasn't really become quite ready for worm habitation yet, if that's the right way to think about it. Because, you know, the worms do rely on a certain infiltration of microbes and bacteria and a certain amount of microscopic decomposition to take place and to thrive in the area where they're going to be. So I just sometimes wonder if they're just needing this feeding area to get a little bit further along before they can really start feeling comfortable in this stuff. But for now, this is the check-in on this attempt to recover some red wigglers from the cocoons of the original population that I've for the most part lost at this point, but would love to try to revive it, even in a small amount if possible. It'd be kind of an interesting experiment, I suppose, to see if I can actually revive a population with just a handful of worms. And it does seem like I might end up with nothing more than just a handful of worms with this experiment. So maybe that's the right way to think about it. It's an experiment to see what we can accomplish here after such a devastating loss. So I guess I'll just sort of, I'm going to get rid of this stick. It doesn't make much sense for it to be in here. So I'm going to just start backfilling in here, and I guess we'll take one last check through this material here. Even when I go all the way to the bottom, the stuff already has kind of a dry feel to it, making me wonder if there's any worms out there at all in it anymore. I would have to guess that very few, if any, could even handle being a material that's this dry anymore. So it's really just a matter of at some point probably just scooping out what's in this collection area, and maybe even some of the stuff that's on the edge, some of this older stuff, just in case there's still worms in that too. And maybe launching off a new little bin, a little tiny environment in which these few worms can grow up to the point where they can maybe mate and reproduce and carry on the original bloodline of the worms that I originally started vermicomposting with. So I'm also wondering if I could sort of limit the coverage in terms of how much of this old material stays damp. I suppose that's fine, you know, if it's really the material that they still feel most comfortable being in, I might as well allow for it to remain damp up until such a time that they feel comfortable moving into the fresh bedding where the food is being provided and where the grit is being provided. So that's it. Interesting little check-in on this unusual bin of mine, which is now technically being tracked and is on my radar, but will hopefully at some point become the origin of one of my newest systems to be launched at some point, using the worms that have come together over within this material. So wish me luck. We'll see where this leads, but for now that's it. That's the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.